This is the reading for Who Rules. Make sure you have a pen, pencil, or highlighter ready so you can mark the text as we go through the reading. The information you'll be marking will be used to make a foldable tomorrow in class, so make sure you highlight everything you are told to. Who rules? Someone's got to be in charge. If you compared all the governments in the world, you would find one thing in common. Someone is in charge. The question is who? There are many different forms of government. Some have one leader who has all the control. Others give power to the people. Here are some forms of government that exist or have existed in the world. Me, myself, and I. An autocracy is a government in which one person has all the power. Underline or highlight that sentence. An autocracy is a government when one person has all the power. There are two main types of autocracy, a monarchy and a dictatorship. So if it's an autocracy, it's a type of government where one person has all the power. But there are different types. One of them is a monarchy, and one of them is a dictator. In a monarchy, a king or queen rules the country. Underline or highlight that sentence. The king or queen is known as a monarch. Monarchs usually come to power through their family line. The current king or queen's oldest child becomes the next king or queen. In some monarchies, especially those in historical times, the monarch held all the power and had the final say over the government. In modern times, monarchs usually share power with other parts of the government. Often they are also subject to the country's constitution. So originally kings and queens had all the power, but now in a more modern monarchy, they're just kind of a part of the government, almost like the president, he's just part of the government, so they don't have all the power anymore. A dictatorship is a form of government where one leader has absolute control over the citizens' lives. Underline or highlight that sentence. A dictator is a form of government where one leader, so one person, has complete control over the people's lives. If there is a constitution, the dictator has control over that too. So it doesn't mean much. Although other parts of the government may exist, such as courts or a lawmaking body, these branches have always do what the dictator wants them to do. They do not represent the citizens. So a dictatorship is like in North Korea, where it's just one guy and what he says goes and he's in charge of everything and the people have no rights.
This episode is brought to you by AJ+. North Korea's constitution describes its government as an independent socialist state. However, many other sources, including the CIA World Factbook, list North Korea as a one-man dictatorship. So what is a dictatorship, and how many countries are still run by dictators? A dictatorship is a form of authoritarian government in which complete power over the people and state is held by one person or political entity. The word is often used interchangeably with terms like tyranny, monarchy, totalitarianism, autocracy, despotism, and even sometimes with words like republic and democracy. For example, North Korea's full title is the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. Modern dictatorships hardly ever refer to themselves as such. Often they will assume the mask of a democracy, complete with phony elections, in order to give legitimacy to their rule. Just look at the recent elections in Zimbabwe and Syria, for example. Once in power, dictators protect their station with military action, restrictions on personal freedoms, propaganda, and even state-sponsored terrorism. Hallmark signs of an authoritarian regime include state-controlled media, rampant corruption and cronyism, and a sizable gap between the wealthy elite and the poor. Often, the loose term of dictatorship is applied to any country where civil liberties are suppressed and all the power is concentrated on one leader or single political unit. How many of these dictatorships exist in the world? It's hard to say. The majority of national governments operate on a spectrum between constitutional democracies like the United States and complete dictatorships like North Korea. There are many nations that fall in between. However, the Economist Intelligence Unit estimates that as of 2014, 52 countries are ruled by authoritarian regimes. Places like China, Cuba, Russia, Syria, and Zimbabwe are on this list, and there are many more. Unfortunately, dictatorships grew stronger in 2014, according to a watchdog organization, Freedom House. Their report, released in 2015, notes that more than half of the world's countries are considered partly free or not free, and there was an overall decline in global political rights and civil liberties last year. However, there are also studies that show most people want a government with democratic values. In the future, trends towards globalization, higher education, and a growing middle class may be the key to eliminating authoritarian governments once and for all. If you want to know who's really calling the shots in North Korea, check out this video from our friends at AJ+.
He's North Korea's very own George Washington, Joseph Stalin, and the Tooth Fairy combined.
Thank you for watching TestTube. Please subscribe.
Power to the people. In a democracy, citizens hold the political power. There are two fundamental types of democracies. So underline or highlight that. In a democracy, the citizens hold the political power, so the power comes from the people. In a representative democracy, citizens elect leaders to represent their rights and interests in the government. Underline or highlight that sentence. The elected leaders or representatives do the day-to-day work of governing the country. They consider the issues, work to find solutions, pass laws, and do all other things necessary to keep a country going. Citizens hold the ultimate power, though, because if they don't like what their representatives are doing, they can vote in new ones. So in a representative democracy, all the people have the power to vote, and they vote for someone to represent them in the lawmaking. So every single person in America is not voting on every single law, but we elect someone to represent us, and they go vote on the laws for us on our behalf. But the power comes back to the people, because if we don't like what they're doing, we can just fire them and get a new one. In a direct democracy, there are no representatives. Citizens are directly involved in the day-to-day working of the government. So underline or highlight the first two sentences there, all the way down to the day-to-day work of governing the government. In a direct democracy, the people directly vote on everything. Citizens might be required to participate in lawmaking or act as judges, for example. The best example of this was an ancient Greek city called Athens. Most modern countries are too large for a direct democracy to work. So like the United States, there's just too many people here. 300 million citizens. That's way too much to have them vote on every single thing the government's going to do. It would take too much time, and the government wouldn't be effective.
The word democracy comes from the Greek words of demos, which means people, and kratos, which means power or rule. So democracy basically means the rule of the people. Democracy first started as a direct democracy in Greek cities, notably ancient Athens, where people came together to speak about their concerns and opinions in front of rulers of the city-state, and directly voted on new rules and laws. Here is considered as the birthplace of democracy. For the very first time, decisions were made by the people instead of rulers. But sadly, the ancient Greeks did not see all people equally. Slaves, women, children, and the people who did not have a land weren't allowed to vote. This is what we call a flawed democracy today. After the Greeks lost their power and influence in the 1st century AD, their early forms of democracy were also fading away until the Magna Carta was signed in 1215, which prevented the King of England to do whatever he wanted and said that even the king had to follow the country's rules and laws which were written in the Constitution. Today, most democracies are indirect or representative, which means that you can't vote for a new law yourself, but you can vote for people who then become lawmakers and present your interests. But democracy isn't just about voting. It's about everything to protect the best interests of the people, no matter what is their race, gender, political opinion, or religion. These interests can be human rights, quality of life, infrastructure, and many more. Modern democracies divide power into 3 different branches: the legislative, the people who make the law; the executive, the people who make sure that you obey the law; and the judiciary, who judge you if you commit a crime. These 3 are independent and work following the process, checks and balances, which means all the work must be clear and fair. And very important, the people who have power also must follow the law and not exceed their authority. In addition, a democratic government must work in a way that reflects the wish, feeling, desire, and values of the society that it governs. This is also known as the general will, which is a concept developed by the famous Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. One of the problems of democratic voting is that the biggest groups of people always have the most power, and that's why a good democracy also has laws to protect the rights of its smaller and weaker groups. A democracy where the majority chooses to separate, expel, or injure its minority is not a functioning democracy. So, what do you think now about democracy? Winston Churchill once said, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." Do you agree?
We, ourselves, and us. In an oligarchy, a small group of people has all the power. Oligarchy is a Greek word that means rule by a few. Sometimes this means that only a certain group has political rights, such as members of one political party, one social class, or one race. For example, in some societies, only noble families who owned land could participate in politics. An oligarchy can also mean that a few people control the country. For example, a junta is a small group of people, usually military officers, who rule a country after taking it over by force. A junta often operates much like a dictatorship, except that several people share power. So go up to the top up there and underline or highlight oligarchy. A small group of people has all the power. So it's kind of like when a military group of small groups, if you look at this picture on the right up here, those guys right there, from 1962 to 2011, they ruled by a military junta that was condemned by the world for its human rights violations. So the rest of the world didn't agree with what they're doing because they didn't consider people's human rights, and they violated the human rights laws that we have. And it was a small group, though, so these guys work together to run the country. So instead of one dictator or one guy being in charge and doing whatever he wants, it's a small group, and they just do whatever they want. Religious rule. A theocracy is a government that recognizes God or a divine being as the ultimate authority. Theo is the Greek word that means God. In a theocracy, religious law is used to settle disputes and rule the people. A theocracy can also be a democracy, dictatorship, monarchy, or just about any other kind of government. For example, the Republic of Iran recognizes Islamic law, but Iran's citizens vote to elect their leaders. Modern theocracies are usually found in countries where the population is strongly religious. So underline or highlight that first sentence about theocracy, and it's just pretty much when their religion is helping to run the country. So you could have a religious leader who's in charge of the country, like they have in Iran where people vote for their own leaders, but they follow religious law. But a theocracy recognizes that a god or divine being is in charge, and they're following that person and not just, their government.
Hi folks, welcome to the next edition of Civics in 60. I apologize for being dressed down today. It's Panther Pride, Blue and White Spirit Day, whatever you want to call it. Hopefully you have some pride in your school and what you're doing when you're at school. Today we're going to look at 5 different kinds of dictatorships. We're going to look at an autocracy, an oligarchy, a totalitarian form of government, a monarchy, and a theocracy. You need to be able to identify all 5 of those for that big test coming up, or you're probably going to struggle. So I'm going to try and do this in 60 seconds. I don't think it's going to happen. All right, so let's start off with the 2 that can categorize the other 3. It makes no sense probably. But anyway, all the other 3 are going to fall under these 2. An autocracy means one person is in charge. One. Autocracy means one person in charge. An oligarchy then means that you have a small group in charge. So it can be 2, 3, 4, 5, 100. As long as it's a small group that's in charge, then you have an oligarchy. Okay, next you have totalitarian form government. Just look at that word and find the base word, total. Think of the Nazi regime and Adolf Hitler. They had total control and wanted total control socially, politically, and economically over their citizens. Next, in a monarchy, in monarchic form of government, think kings and queens. How do they get their jobs? How do they get into the government? And they're simply born into it. It comes to them by heredity and bloodline. Finally, in a theocracy, think the ancient Egyptians and the pharaohs. Those pharaohs were put there, and they believed by their gods, by their religious entities. And their right-hand men and advisors were the priests. Therefore, they believed all their decisions came from a higher power as well. So there's your 5 forms of dictatorships in about 65 seconds. I missed, but I knew that'd be a challenge. As always, if you enjoyed this project, make sure you look down here below and subscribe. And as always, again, peace out.
Rule by none. In an anarchy, nobody is in control, or everyone is, depending on how you look at it. Sometimes the word anarchy is used to refer to an out-of-control mob. When it comes to government, anarchy would be one way to describe the human state of existence before any governments developed. It would be similar to the way animals live in the wild, with everyone looking out for themselves. Today, people who call themselves anarchists usually believe that people should be allowed to freely associate together without being subject to any nation or government. There are no countries that have an anarchy as their form of government. So an anarchy means no government, nothing's going on at all. Look at this chart down here at the bottom. Make sure you underline or highlight what anarchy meant in that top sentence though. And then look at this chart down here at the bottom. Who rules? On the far left it says none, so that would be anarchy. One leader would be like a monarchy or a dictatorship, so a king or queen or a dictator. A few, so when you have a couple people in charge, it's an oligarchy. And when you have all, so all the people are in charge of what's going on, it's a democracy. And there are two types, the direct and representatives. And then it says, where would you put theocracy on this chart? So I want you to mark that on this chart now, and then continue on with the handouts that are associated with this reading.